I'm terrible at pimping my stuff, so I thought dressing like a pimp might make it a little bit easier. I have blogs where you can read stuff and see things and interact with me. My main one is postmortemstudios.wordpress.com. My writing one and sort of diary blog is over at talesofgrim.wordpress.com. Hope to see you there. Hello lovelies, it's game review time again, and this time we're looking at Things from the Flood, which is the follow-up to Tales from the Loop. So let's give this a little bit of context, shall we? These games are based on the artwork of Simon Stalenhag. I think that's how you pronounce it. He's done a whole bunch of paintings that are kind of retro, like 70s, 80s, I guess, 90s, mixed with robots and other science fictional elements and so on. It's almost the future as it was imagined then, but using modern techniques, some more modern ideas and fears and so on. It's really captured people's attention a few years back, and he sold a few art books and had his ideas licensed out as tabletop games from that. So it's a sequel to Tales from the Loop, in which the characters are teenagers rather than kids. So it's young adults in old cars, I guess, rather than kids on bikes. And it certainly does have more of a horror aesthetic than Tales from the Loop does. So and it's set in the 1990s. So, you know, I was born in 1975. So my formative teenage years were pretty much the 1990s. So yeah, that's when I was a proper teenager. That's when I was a young adult. Yeah, this is the time that I experienced, and there's some embarrassing photos of me in that period to kind of prove it. So I guess in a lot of ways this game should be targeted to me in terms of nostalgia, but it doesn't quite hit the mark so far as I'm concerned, and I'm not sure whether that's down to regional differences between the UK and Sweden, or personal differences in that my personal experience of the 1990s was different to lots of other people's, but then Britain was a different animal to a lot of other places during the 90s. In terms of art and design, this is very much a retread of Tales from the Loop, and you may notice that when I game review normally, I have the book here and I put the camera down on it and I just kind of talk my way through it. But I don't feel that does justice to Simon Stalenhag's art, particularly in this case because, again, they've gone for the matte paper, which I don't think presents his art in the best possible light. This is one of those rare cases where I think shelling out for the gloss full colour paper is actually worth it. And given that so much of what makes this game appealing is the art, it's a peculiar choice to go for that cheaper matte full colour. It just doesn't really work with it. It's laid out fairly nicely, it's fairly readable. The art does feel like it over-dominates the text here and there. I think maybe it could have been spaced out more and given the text more room to flow naturally. That could have been one way to go about it. So we've had two games now based on Simon Stalenhag's work. We've had Tales from the Loop, Things from the Flood. He does have a third book, The Electric State. Now, I haven't kept up on news from Modiphius or Free League, so I don't know if they're doing a third book based on that, but that's more of a personal story, and while it shares themes with Tales from the Loop and Things from the Flood, it doesn't progress exactly. And where those are set in the real world but different, Electric State is set in a fictional place called Pacifica, in which there's still robots and everything. So whether that art could be used to present an adventure or a campaign based in Tales from the Loop or Things from the Flood, or as a separate game entirely that happens to use the same aesthetic, and the same art, or whether it will end up being a third book. I don't know. I haven't kept up on the news there. Probably should have taken the 5 minutes to Google it before I did the review, but I didn't. But as we'll see later on, I think that might, if it's done as a sequel, I think it might present issues to the people writing it. If it's done as a campaign, those things never sell as well. Might be seen as a gouge, perhaps. It presents a whole bunch of problems, but it is a shame that art has not been incorporated and used. But I'm sure Stalinarg's getting commissions for plenty of other things, so maybe it's not too much of an issue. So yeah, there's not a lot extra to say here. If you've seen my review of Tales from the Loop, if you've read Tales from the Loop and it's to your fancy, fair enough. For me, I see some drawbacks. It doesn't really allow the art to shine. The text is broken up so much by the art that it doesn't necessarily flow naturally, and referencing through the book is a little bit tricky. But if you want the full effect of the art, yeah, you can visit Stalinarg's pages and galleries. You could get the PDF version, or I'm not sure if it's Modifius that does that. Their PDFs are wildly overpriced. So maybe buy the book and then pirate the PDF to get the best effect of the art, perhaps. The system hasn't really changed. I don't think it's a particularly great system. It's very simple and easy and story light, and light as well. So it's got a lot going for it in that regard, but sometimes you just need something a little bit more crunchy, and the system very much breaks down and fails when it does that. Doing anything, though it defaults to you doing anything being quite difficult, is too difficult, I think. You need to score 6s to succeed, so basically you need 6 dice to be averagely competent at a difficult task, because one of those is likely to come up 6, and difficulties rise to 2 or 3 6s being needed, and it encourages you to gamble and push to re-roll your dice to get the amount of success needed. Now in Tales from the Loop, you couldn't die unless it was absolutely, story essential that you did, or there was absolutely no way that you couldn't die from the situation that you were in. So it was very light on the peril, for all it had some dark themes and so on. In Things from the Flood, we up from light peril to moderate peril. You can die, you can have permanently nasty things happen to your character, but these are kind of out there. You take consequences as you fail, and particularly as you push yourself and fail, and that can be emotional damage, winded, exhausted, injured, whatever. And once you run out of that, then you start running the risk of getting real lasting consequences and perhaps even dying. But it's not really an imminent threat in any situation, which can make it hard to motivate and to threaten characters and to get them moving if the system doesn't back up what you're trying to create in the narrative. So you can have a bunch of people pointing guns at them, and they might not necessarily feel quite as motivated to get out of the way as they would in real life. You can consider that poor role-playing if you like, but the system is the physics of the game setting, and ideally you want system and setting to work entirely in synergy, and I'm not convinced that it necessarily does here, particularly given the character of Things from the Flood, which is much more dark, much more horrific. There's monstrous illustrations of things scattered throughout the book, but while the system allows for darker outcomes, it doesn't really quite get there. It does very much play up the story element, the drama element, which makes sense if you're playing teenagers between 14 and 19, I guess. But it does have all the same sorts of problems that Tales from the Loop has. It's an all or nothing system gamble that offloads most of the concern, most of the rolling and so on onto the players, which is good for improvisational GMing, takes a lot of the headaches and the paperwork out of it, but it means that NPCs don't roll, and that's just it's so much more of an issue when it comes to a setting with moderate peril, certainly, than it did in Tales from the Loop, where things were just light peril. So it's a let's sit down and have a story time game. It's not really a game in that sense. It's just it kind of suits the mood that they're going for, but is more suited to Tales from the Loop than Things from the Flood, and it isn't really changed enough to emphasize the different themes in Things from the Flood, in my humble subjective opinion. The setting is broadly the same. The Malaran Islands, I think that's how you pronounce it. Boulder City is given as the alternative, and other possible settings are given a bit of short shrift. They could have used a bit of space here to present ideas for loops in other areas. But things have changed, things have broken down, things are no longer as positive and futurist oriented as they once were. There's a thing called machine cancer that's spreading from robot to robot and robot to other electronic devices. There's a flood, some kind of potential rupture in reality, but hot brown water is seeping out from where the loops are and potentially contaminating and mutating and screwing up everything that it comes into contact with, which isn't good. The whole setting is based around a collapse, which is basically a fait accompli by 2005. All this wondrous stuff that exists in the setting through from the 1950s really, through the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, all of it fails or stops working or breaks down or is in the process of breaking down. All that wondrous promise from that earlier time is breaking down and gone away. And at the end of the period that this game covers in its timeline, things are essentially exactly the same as our reality now, which is more than a little depressing, which I get is what they're going for in this. But I guess I'm a modernist at heart, and I see progress as almost inevitable. You know, you can fall back, but you always progress again. You build upon what came before, even if you have fallen back. At least that's what's keeping me going at the moment. And for me, at least, the 90s, while they had that grunge aesthetic and that don't care aesthetic, Gen X became extremely resistant to ideology and advertising in a way that generations before and since haven't particularly. But it doesn't quite fit with my experience of the 90s or where Britain was in the 90s. I don't think. Maybe America felt more like it, maybe Sweden felt more like it, but for me that was quite jarring and hopeless as a setting. It's very depressing, it's very controlling. Contrary to what that song just told you, things can only get worse, seems to be the message of Things from the Flood. Its themes are very much centered around teenage drama and angst, the breakdown of the idealized world from Tales from the Loop, the rot that sets in, and it's easy to see that as a common theme in a lot of media: the loss of innocence, the loss of childhood, the onset of adult responsibilities and dramas and relationships and all the rest of it. It's easy to see those kind of literary themes cropping up in this game, and to see how that relates to the different age of the characters and the previous game and all the rest of it. But it does, as I intimated before, kind of spit in the face of the idea of progress. And I think if we had cracked artificial intelligence, if we had cracked essentially anti-gravity for certain vehicles, I don't think we'd be so quick or easy to let it go. And I don't think a pole reversal, which is spoiler alert, one of the plot keys, would put an end to magnetically levitating transport, because all it means is it goes in the opposite direction. It doesn't change anything. So there's aspects of this that don't really make any sense. There's a lot of themes and ideas that are pretty obvious. It picks up on the sort of hacker culture, leak culture that came around in the 90s, rave culture and so on, but it doesn't vibe with my experience of the 90s, and I don't think it vibes with the British experience of the 90s. Sure, we had the rave culture and everything else, but the 90s were a big time of hope and change in Britain. In 97, we finally got shot of the Tories. Tony Blair's new Labour came in, and a lot of people on the left were pretty happy about that, until the Iraq War. Obviously, there was a huge cultural boom around Britpop. It was cool Britannia, you know. That was the big thing. The Millennium celebrations at the end of the decade, all of it. It was much more positive and upbeat. There was a lot of technical progress, technical investment. Britain felt like it was at the forefront of culture and technology in the world. Oh, how we have fallen since. But we were active participants in Europe with a bit more of a positive outlook on Europe. And so that experience of the 90s, while we also had the grunge aesthetic, the ravers, the road protests, the environmental protests, riot girls, all the rest of it, but overall the vibe was a lot more positive and forward thinking, and Things from the Flood is much more negative, much more ground down. It just doesn't jive with at least my subjective British experience of the 1990s, and makes it hard for me. I can see where they're going with the themes. I do think they're a bit too obvious, perhaps, but the whole setting feels hopeless, like it's an inevitable winding down and a loss of all these magical, wonderful things that give the setting its character and its meaning and its feel and its uniqueness, or for the sake of converging with our mundane reality in terms of the internet and everything else, which is full of wonders of its own, but at the loss of these wonders that exist in the setting. And it's extremely jarring, and I'm sure they're trying to make all kinds of points about how technology can be used for bad and wrong and unintended effects, and the loss of innocence, the loss of youth, the loss of fantasy, the magic that disappears as you grow up, and all the rest of it. But it just feels a bit hackneyed, and from a game approach, it feels like there's nothing to work for. Like there's no bright future. You can't make a difference. Yeah, this has a certain sense of inevitability to it, at least in the setting. Now, of course, you can run your own game differently, but within the setting, and when reviewing, you have to review things as given. It's an inevitable slide to mundane reality, and that's extremely disheartening. Content is broadly the same as Tales from the Loop. You've got some setting information, you've got some timelines, some background data. Game rules don't take up very much room at all because they're barely there. Character creation, a little bit longer. You've got some basic stereotypes that you can choose from or modify to suit yourself. And the bulk of the book is, as with Tales from the Loop, given over to adventures. Which I'm not a fan of in core books, because you're only really ever going to use that information once, and so it pads out a book and increases the price of a buy-in. It just makes the game less accessible. It presents more information, but information that is of relatively low utility or reusability. Now, you can make an argument for including an example adventure in a core book to introduce people to the systems, how you expect the game to be played, or all that kind of stuff. But this is a sequel to Tales from the Loop, which already covered that extremely adequately, and so the amount of space given over to that, it was too much in Tales from the Loop, and it's definitely too much in Things from the Flood. Some basic adventure seeds, some more creatures, some defined enemies or challenges or something like that, that would be a lot more useful than what we get here, which is sort of mini adventures, maybe long enough for a convention slot if you have a really motivated group of players. But adventures is just a waste of space and a cost multiplier for getting buy-in to a game series, and particularly when it's a sequel or a follow-up, I just don't think it's justified. Do adventures separately, lower the price of your main book, get people hooked and interested that way. Anything more than like one very basic example of play or a very simple, very basic, this is how you do it adventure, anything more than that is really misplaced. Unless you're doing a setting book, but then settings are different to adventures anyway. It's just raw information and hooks and so on. So there's just not enough content in this book that's useful. Alright, final thoughts then. It would be remiss of me not to remind everyone about the scandal that sprang up around this game when it was used to run a teen horror / sex comedy adventure at a UK convention. The people playing the game didn't speak up at the time, accused the person running it of all kinds of things. No real evidence or proof any of that ever took place, but they were taken at their word, and he was basically barred from the conventions for the foreseeable future. Things from the Flood is a more horrific game, and it is targeted at teenagers, so it is not at all out of character for the game for anything horrible or strange of these kinds to go on in the game. I don't think the system is particularly suited to that, but the setting would certainly seem to fit that with its hopelessness, teen culture. It talks about raving, Club 18 to 30 isn't that different to that. The In-Betweeners has its darkly humorous, blackly humorous moments. None of this is really that out of character for the setting. People should read their sign-up sheets more accurately, I think, is the lesson to be taken from that. But it's not at all out of character for that kind of scenario to play out in this setting as it's written. Scores then. Style, 4 out of 5. Losing the point because the artwork is not shown off to best effect in the book using the printing methods that they have chosen to use. It really needs that glossy, high quality colour print to really bring Stalsberg's art to life. In terms of content, it's a retread, rules-wise. There's not really a lot in the way of expansion or difference other than mild peril. The adventures are essentially wasted space that could have been used for more conventional but also more useful role-playing material. Generic locations, creatures, robots, that sort of thing. And it's just not there. I would say 2 out of 5, which gives an overall score of 6 out of 10 or 3 out of 5, which is right in that deeply average area. But keep in mind that the real thing that saves that score and takes it to average is the sheer quality and imagination shown in the art, which isn't necessarily followed up on in the text, at least not in a way that is geared to games. Now, I might be being unfair because it's more of a story game and I'm looking at it as a game, as a role-playing game, but that's how I feel, and that's my score. 3 out of 5. Deeply average. Zang.
Machinations of the Space Princess is an old-school RPG with a sci-fi setting. The rules are familiar and at once innovative. Opened up so you can play literally any alien species you can envision. Purchase it at RPG Now or Lulu.com.